The morning Jedediah Garrett drove the last fence post into the hardpan earth of his Montana property, he looked out over the rolling golden grass and said out loud to nobody but the wind, "I am done with all of it." And then he heard the creak of his front gate and turned around to find a woman standing there with dust on her boots and desperation quiet in her eyes. He had meant every word of that promise. He truly had. The year was 1883, and Jedediah Garrett was 34 years old, which was old enough to have made every mistake a man could make in the territory of Montana, and young enough to still feel the weight of those mistakes every single morning when he pulled on his boots. He had ridden with men whose names were known across 3 territories. He had carried a gun for hire longer than he cared to count. He had been a ranch hand, a scout, a bounty hunter, and somewhere in the dark middle years of his 20s, something that sat even less comfortably on his conscience. He had never been an outlaw, not technically, not in the sense that his name appeared on any wanted poster, but he had ridden close enough to that line that he could describe the line in detail. Then 3 years ago, he had ridden north. He had taken every dollar he had accumulated, and there were more of those than a man should have from the kind of work he had done, and he had purchased 60 acres of decent grazing land outside the small town of Clearwater, Montana. He had built the house himself, log by log. He had strung the fence line himself, post by post. He had acquired a modest herd of cattle, 8 horses, 2 dogs named Silas and Wren, and a reputation in Clearwater as a man who kept to himself and paid his bills on time and caused no trouble whatsoever. That reputation had taken 3 years of careful, quiet living to build, and he intended to keep it. Which was why, when he turned around and saw the woman standing at his gate on the last day of September 1883, his first instinct was to feel something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with the recognition that trouble, in his experience, had a way of appearing just when a man thought he was finally clear of it. She was not what he expected trouble to look like. She stood perhaps 5 feet and 4 inches tall, with dark brown hair that had mostly escaped whatever arrangement she had started the day with, so that loose strands blew sideways across her face in the September wind. She wore a blue calico dress that had seen better days, practical boots, and a traveling coat that was adequate for early fall but would not serve her well once winter truly arrived. She carried a canvas bag over one shoulder and held the gate latch with both hands as though she were not entirely certain she was welcome but had decided to stand her ground regardless. She was, he thought, perhaps 26 or 27 years old, somewhere in that range. Her face was not soft in the way of women who had lived easily. There were lines around her eyes that spoke of worry, not age, and her jaw was set with the particular determination of someone who was holding themselves together through sheer will. "Are you Jedediah Garrett?" she asked. Her voice was steady, which surprised him. Most people who showed up at a stranger's gate looking the way she did let some of the strain through in their voices. "I am," he said. He did not move from where he stood, 5 yards from her, hammer still in his hand from the fence post. "Who are you?" "Susan Blackwell," she said. "I was told in town that you sometimes take on hired help in exchange for room and board. I was told you are a decent man." Jedediah set the hammer down on the fence rail slowly. He looked at her for a long moment, reading the way she was standing, the careful way she was watching him. There was no guile in her expression. There was only the exhaustion and the quiet pride of someone who had come a very long way and used up a very large portion of their courage just getting to this gate. "Who told you that?" he said. "Mrs. Clara Hutchins at the dry goods store," Susan said. "She said you were fair and that you had the largest spread nearest to town with no woman running the household. She said you might be in need of a housekeeper." Jedediah considered this. Clara Hutchins had a sharp eye and a sharper tongue, and she generally had good judgment about people, which was why he tolerated her sending strangers his way from time to time when she thought those strangers might be useful to him. He had never entirely figured out whether Clara was being helpful to him or helpful to the strangers, but the arrangement had worked out adequately on the 2 previous occasions. "You from around here?" he said. "No," Susan said. "I came up from Billings." "Before that, Cheyenne, you come alone." Something moved across her face at that, not fear exactly, something more complicated. "Yes," she said, "I am alone." Jedediah looked past her down the long dirt road that led from his property back toward the main trail to Clearwater. There was no wagon, no horse, no traveling companion visible anywhere. Just the empty road and the September sky going golden above the mountains to the west. "You walked from town," he said. "It is only 4 miles," Susan said, and the faintest possible edge of defiance crept into her voice, as though she knew exactly how she must look and had decided she was not going to apologize for it. He almost smiled at that. Almost. Instead he said, "Come inside, I will put coffee on." He saw her exhale, the first real release of breath she had allowed herself since arriving at the gate, and he understood that she had been genuinely uncertain of her welcome and had been holding herself rigid against the possibility of refusal. She let go of the gate latch and pushed it open, and Jedediah turned toward the house, and that was how it began. The kitchen was clean and sparse, as befitted a man who lived alone and cooked simply. Jedediah built up the fire in the stove, filled the coffee pot from the water barrel, and gestured for Susan to sit at the table. She set her canvas bag on the floor beside her chair and sat straight, folding her hands on the table in front of her. She did not look around the kitchen with the appraising look of someone calculating what they could get out of the situation. She looked at him directly, which he found unusual. "Tell me what brings you to Montana from Cheyenne by way of Billings," he said, "and be straight with me. I will know if you are not." "I was not trying to be anything other than straight," Susan said. "I am 30 years old. My father died in February in Cheyenne. He had debts that I did not know about, and when those debts were settled, there was nothing left of the property. I had a situation working as a school teacher in Cheyenne, but the school board determined that an unmarried woman without family in the territory was not a suitable long-term candidate for the position, and they let me go in March." Jedediah poured the coffee and set a cup in front of her and sat down across the table. "Why Montana? Why not stay in Wyoming?" Susan wrapped both hands around the cup. "There were reasons to leave Cheyenne quickly," she said, and she looked at him steadily, not elaborating but not looking away either. He nodded slowly. He understood the shape of what she was not saying even without knowing the details. Sometimes a place turned sour and the only remedy was distance. "What can you do?" he said. "I can cook and keep house, which you can see from this kitchen that you are managing adequately on your own," she said, with a slight dryness that told him she had a sense of humor she was keeping carefully leashed. "I can keep accounts and records. I can read and write in English and in some French. I taught school for 4 years, so I am competent at mathematics and literature. I am a good hand with a vegetable garden, and I know enough about cattle to help with basic ranch records, though I will not pretend I am a cowhand." "I have cowhands," Jedediah said. "2 of them. They do not live on the property." He studied her over his coffee cup. She was telling the truth, he believed. He had spent enough years in the company of people who lied to him regularly that he had developed a reasonable ability to recognize the difference, though he had learned to hold that confidence lightly. "The situation I can offer," he said carefully, "is a room in the house, the back bedroom. There is a bolt on the door from the inside. Your wages would be $12 a month and full board. In exchange, you would manage the household, keep the accounts, cook the meals. Nothing else beyond that would be expected or requested." Susan looked at him with an expression that managed to be both grateful and assessing at once. "That is a fair offer," she said, "and I appreciate the specificity." "I have found it best to be specific," Jedediah said. "So have I," Susan said. She started the following morning. He discovered quickly that Susan Blackwell was not a fragile woman. She was up before him on that first day, had the stove burning and biscuits baking by the time he came through the kitchen to start his morning, and she had already swept the front room, and organized the pile of receipts and invoices he had left accumulating on the side table into a neat stack that she had begun to sort chronologically. She worked with an efficient quietness that he found immediately comfortable, which surprised him, because he had grown accustomed to his solitude and had expected to find the presence of another person in his house disruptive. Instead, it felt like something that had been slightly off balance for a long time had quietly corrected itself. He pushed that thought away firmly and went to tend his horses. The town of Clearwater had opinions about everything, as small towns do, and within 1 week of Susan Blackwell's arrival at Jedediah Garrett's property, those opinions were being expressed with enthusiasm. Jedediah heard the first of them from his hired hand Tom Ridley, who was a 22-year-old from Missouri with an open face and poor ability to keep his thoughts to himself. "People in town are saying you have taken in a housekeeper," Tom said, while they were working on the north fence line together one Wednesday morning. "Mrs. Hutchins is saying she is a school teacher and a very respectable lady. Old Pete at the saloon has a different opinion." "Old Pete at the saloon has an opinion about everything and is correct about approximately none of it," Jedediah said flatly. "Miss Blackwell is my housekeeper. Keep your mind on the fence." Tom kept his mind on the fence, but Jedediah was aware that his other hired hand, a quiet, experienced older man named Frank Delaney, was watching the situation with the patient, unspoken observation of someone who had been around long enough to see how things developed. Frank was 51 years old, had worked cattle ranches across Wyoming and Montana for 30 years, and communicated primarily through silence and occasional significant looks. He said nothing about Susan to Jedediah directly. He did, however, begin to find small reasons to be working near the house more often than strictly necessary. The first time Susan brought out water and biscuits to Frank and Tom during a long afternoon working the east pasture, Frank had removed his hat, thanked her formally, and looked at Jedediah with an expression that communicated a great deal in no words at all. Jedediah ignored the expression. He was good at ignoring a great many things about Susan Blackwell, and he applied himself to this task with considerable discipline. He ignored the fact that she laughed sometimes when she thought he was out of earshot, a genuine, unguarded laugh that sounded like someone who had not had much occasion to use it recently and was finding the muscles for it again. He ignored the way she had taken it upon herself to plant a small kitchen garden in the sheltered spot behind the house, even though autumn was no time for planting, and was apparently laying the groundwork for a spring garden with the focused determination of someone who intended to be here when spring arrived. He ignored the way she had, without being asked, begun reading aloud in the evenings from whatever book she had in her canvas bag. Not to him, exactly, just aloud, in the room where he sat doing his account work, so that the sound of her voice reading filled the house in a way that made the silence feel less like absence and more like peace. He ignored all of it very determinedly. He was particularly determined to ignore the evening in late October when he came in late from a difficult situation with a calf that had gotten into the north draw and required 2 hours of patient work to extract and return to its mother. And Susan had kept his supper warm on the stove without comment, and had set it on the table for him, and then had sat down across from him with her own cup of tea and the book she was reading, just being quietly present in the lamplight. And he had looked at her across the kitchen table and felt something shift somewhere deep in his chest that he had absolutely no intention of examining. He ate his supper and said thank you, and Susan said you are welcome, and she went back to her book, and that was all that happened. But something had shifted, and he could not entirely unshift it. November arrived with the first real cold, and with it, a complication. A man rode onto the property on a Thursday afternoon when Jedediah was at the far end of the south pasture, and Tom was the only one near the house. The man's name, as Jedediah would learn later, was Dale Putnam. He was approximately 35, well-dressed in the manner of a man who wanted to project wealth rather than actually having it, and he had ridden up from Billings. Tom came to find him with an expression that was trying very hard not to show alarm and failing. "There is a man at the house," Tom said. "He asked for Miss Blackwell by name. She let him in. I did not know if I should." Jedediah was already walking. He came into the kitchen to find Susan standing against the far wall with her arms crossed, and a stillness about her that was not calm but was the controlled cousin of calm, and a man he did not recognize sitting at his kitchen table with his hat pushed back, and a smile that did not reach his eyes. The man looked at Jedediah with the quick, calculating assessment of someone who was accustomed to taking the measure of obstacles. "You must be Garrett," Putnam said. "I am looking for Susan. She is a friend of mine from Cheyenne." "He is not my friend," Susan said, and her voice was steady in that remarkable way it had of being steady when it should have been shaking. "Now, Susan," Putnam said, turning the smile toward her, "that is not a kind thing to say. I have come all this way." "I would like you to leave," Susan said. "I told you in Billings and I am telling you again here. I do not have anything of yours and I want nothing from you." Jedediah positioned himself between Putnam and Susan without making a production of it, just moved to stand where he was standing. He looked at Putnam with the particular flat quality of attention that he had spent the last 3 years trying not to have occasion to use. "You heard her," Jedediah said. "She would like you to leave." Putnam looked at him for a long moment, recalculating. The smile thinned slightly. "I have a legitimate concern regarding property belonging to me that Susan was holding for safekeeping. A letter, just a letter." "I do not have your letter," Susan said evenly. "I told you that in Billings." "I think you might be mistaken about. She has said what she has to say," Jedediah said, "and I will not repeat myself past this point." Putnam looked at him again, and whatever he saw there, whatever it was in Jedediah's face that 3 years of quiet living had not entirely erased, made him reach some internal conclusion. He pushed his chair back and stood, taking his hat off the table. "I may return," Putnam said pleasantly, "when Miss Blackwell has had more time to reflect." "If you return, you will do it on business with me directly," Jedediah said. "Ride on." Putnam rode on. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment after the sound of his horse faded down the road. Susan let out the breath she was holding and sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs. The controlled stillness she had been wearing dissolved all at once, and he could see that her hands, now resting on the table in front of her, were trembling slightly. Jedediah pulled out the chair across from her and sat. He waited. After a moment she looked up at him. "I should have told you," she said. "I should have told you before I came here. I am sorry." "Tell me now," he said. She told him. Dale Putnam had been a business associate of her father's in Cheyenne. The kind of business associate who operated in the gray spaces between legal and not. When her father died and the debts were being settled, Susan had discovered among her father's papers a letter that had implications she did not fully understand, but which she recognized as potentially dangerous. A letter that detailed arrangements Putnam had made with a local official, arrangements that would have constituted fraud and would have exposed Putnam to significant legal jeopardy if the letter became known. She had not taken the letter with her when she left Cheyenne. She had burned it. But Putnam did not believe that. He believed she had taken it because she was a schoolteacher and schoolteachers kept things, or that was his reasoning. He had followed her to Billings and she had managed to get ahead of him and reach Clearwater, and now he had found her here. "The letter does not exist anymore," she said. "It has not existed since the 3rd week of March, but I do not know how to make him believe that." Jedediah was quiet for a moment. He was thinking several things simultaneously. He was thinking about Putnam's eyes and the calculation he had seen in them. He was thinking about the particular shape of men like Putnam, men who did not accept being told no, and who equated persistence with eventual victory. He was thinking, with some discomfort, that the skills required to handle a man like Putnam were precisely the skills he had been trying to leave behind. He was also thinking about Susan's trembling hands and the remarkable effort she had been making to hold herself together, and the way she had looked at him after Putnam rode away, not with the expectation that he would fix everything, but with the simple honesty of someone finally telling the truth to a person they had come to trust. That last thought was the one that settled something. "He will come back," Jedediah said. "I know," Susan said. "When he does, I will deal with it." She shook her head slightly. "I cannot ask you to." "You did not ask me," Jedediah said. "I am telling you how it will go." She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted from guarded to something quieter and more open. "Why?" she said. It was a genuine question, not rhetorical, not testing, just honest. Jedediah considered it honestly. "Because you are on my property," he said. "Because you work for me and you are my responsibility. Because you burned the letter and you are telling the truth, and he is a man who is going to keep frightening you until someone makes clear to him that the cost of continuing is too high." He paused. "Those are the practical reasons." "And the impractical ones," she said, very quietly. He looked at her across the table. "I will let you know when I have sorted them out," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she dropped her eyes to her hands, and a small, careful smile moved across her face. She did not ask him about his past. He was aware of this. He was aware that she could see the shape of it, that a man who lived alone on 60 acres in Montana, and who could look at Dale Putnam across a kitchen table and make him decide to ride away on the strength of an expression alone, was not a man whose history was entirely uncomplicated. She did not ask, and he found himself, unexpectedly, wanting to tell her. He started on a Sunday evening in late November. They were sitting in the main room after supper, the fire burning low and steady, the wind coming off the mountains and pressing at the walls of the house. Susan was darning one of his wool socks with the focused precision she brought to every task. He was sitting in the chair near the window with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, watching the fire. "I was a hired gun," he said. She looked up from the sock. She did not look alarmed. She looked like someone who had half expected this and was listening. "Not an outlaw," he said. "I want to be precise about that. I worked for ranchers, sometimes for railroad companies, twice for what passed for local law in territories where there was not much law to speak of. But I was paid to be the kind of man who other men did not want to face, and that distinction between hired and outlaw gets thin enough in practice that I do not put too much weight on it." "How long?" Susan asked. 8 years, he said, 24 to 32. She was quiet for a moment, her hands still on the darning. "What made you stop?" He looked at the fire. "A man named Roy Callister," he said. "He was a cattle baron in Wyoming with a dispute over water rights with 4 families of settlers. I was hired to make those families reconsider their position. What that meant in practice was riding onto their properties and making the kind of demonstration that would convince them to leave." He paused. "One of the families had a boy, maybe 12 years old, who came out of the barn and saw me and my 2 associates riding up, and the look on his face." He stopped. He had not told this story before, not aloud, not to anyone. "I did not harm anyone," he continued. "I turned my horse around. I told my 2 associates I was done and rode north. I sent back Callister's advance payment with a note." He finally looked at Susan. "I understand that the years before that one incident were not redeemed by it. I understand that, but that was the moment." Susan put the darning down in her lap and looked at him steadily. "You rode north," she said. "You built this." "I tried to," he said. "You did," she said simply. "I have been here 2 months. I have watched you. You are not that man anymore." He did not know what to do with that. He had not expected the clean simplicity of it, the way she said it without absolution-seeking and without reservation, just as a thing she had observed and believed to be true. "I am not entirely sure those things are as separate as I would like them to be," he said. "Either am I," Susan said, "but I think that is true of most people. The question is what you do with the distance between who you were and who you are trying to be." He was quiet for a long time. "You were a teacher," he said finally. A real smile crossed her face, the unguarded kind, and for a moment the worry lines around her eyes smoothed out and he saw what she must have looked like when life had been easier. "I was," she said, "and some habits persist." He slept better that night than he had in years. December arrived, and with it, Christmas approaching and the cattle requiring extra attention in the cold, and something that had been quietly developing between Jedediah and Susan for 2 months began to become impossible to continue pretending was nothing. It was not dramatic. It did not arrive in a single moment of revelation. It built the way everything real builds, in accumulated small things. It was Susan spending an entire Saturday afternoon with Frank Delaney, who had come to the house to help repair the roof of the smokehouse. And by the end of the afternoon, Frank was talking to her about his wife Mary, who had died of fever in 1879, which he had not spoken of to anyone in 4 years. It was the way Jedediah watched this from across the yard and felt something warm and complicated in his chest. It was the afternoon Susan came out to the south pasture while Jedediah was working a young horse, a gray 3-year-old with a strong will and a sideways opinion about everything. And she leaned on the fence rail and watched him work. And after an hour he realized he had been riding better than usual because she was watching. And that realization embarrassed him and amused him in equal measure. It was the morning he woke before dawn to find that it had snowed in the night, 6 inches of clean white covering the land. And when he came into the kitchen, she had already started the coffee and was standing at the window watching the snow and the gray pre-dawn light. And there was an expression on her face that was peaceful and private. And he stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment just watching her. And then she heard him and turned, and neither of them said anything. And the quiet between them was not uncomfortable but full. It was the evening she asked him what his life had been like before the years he was not proud of, what his childhood had been, and he found himself telling her about a farm in Tennessee, and a father who had been hard but not unkind, and a mother who had read to him every evening by firelight, and the way her eyes had been when she listened to him talk about his mother, the care in them, had undone something in him that he had not known was still wound tight. It was all of these things, and it was the way she said his name. She had started using his first name sometime in November, without ceremony, simply because it fit, and he had started using hers, and when she said Jedediah with that particular quality of attention she had, something in him responded to it in a way that his name had never made him feel before. Christmas Eve came, and Susan made a proper dinner, roasting a chicken she had been trading extra biscuits with Tom Ridley's mother to acquire, and there were sweet potatoes and cornbread, and a dried apple pie that she had been planning for 2 weeks. Frank Delaney came to dinner, and Tom Ridley came with his mother Ruth, who was a small, fierce woman of 50 with a gray braid and sharp eyes, who took in the scene in Jedediah Garrett's house, with the expression of someone confirming a long-held theory. After dinner, while Frank and Tom were talking by the fire, and Ruth Ridley was helping Susan with the dishes over Susan's mild protests, Ruth said something quietly to Susan that made Susan go still for a moment, and then a color rose in Susan's cheeks, and she shook her head, and Jedediah, who was near enough to catch the shape of the conversation if not the words, looked away before she could see him looking. Later, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet, Susan and Jedediah sat by the fire with the last of the coffee. The fire had burned down to glowing coals. The wind had dropped and outside the night was very still. "What did Ruth Ridley say to you?" Jedediah asked. Susan was quiet for a moment. "She said that a man who looks at a woman the way you look at me needs to be encouraged or he will go on being stubborn about it for years." The fire crackled quietly. "She said that," Jedediah said. "She was not subtle," Susan said. "Ruth Ridley is not a subtle person." "No," he agreed. "She is not." He looked at the coals. "Am I as obvious as all that?" "To Ruth Ridley, apparently," Susan said. "I cannot speak for everyone." Another pause. He turned his head and looked at her. She was looking at the fire, her profile in the low amber light, her hands around her coffee cup. "Susan," he said. She turned to look at him, the careful, direct way she always looked at him when she was fully present. "I am not a man who," he started and then stopped, because the sentence he had started was the beginning of an excuse, and he did not make excuses for himself. He had learned not to do that. He started again. "I have not let myself want things," he said, "not since I came here. Because wanting things felt like it belonged to a different version of me, and I was not sure that version was trustworthy." Susan set her coffee cup down. "And now," she said, "and now I am sitting here on Christmas Eve," he said, "and I find that I have been wanting something for several months, and the effort of pretending otherwise has become," he paused, "considerable." She looked at him. Something in her expression had opened. The guardedness she wore like quiet armor had come down, and what was underneath it was warm and clear and certain. "I am not a woman who frightens easily," she said. "I came to your gate with nothing. I burned a letter that a dangerous man wanted on principle, because it was the right thing to do. I walked 4 miles on a September morning and introduced myself to a complete stranger and asked for work." She held his gaze. "I am not frightened of wanting things either." Jedediah reached across the small space between their chairs and took her hand. His hand was large and rough from ranch work, and hers was slender and warm, and she turned her hand and held his back. They sat that way for a long time, watching the coals. That was the beginning of something that neither of them put a name to immediately, because they were both people who moved carefully and believed that names should be earned by the weight of what they carried, not applied at the first feeling. But something had begun, and both of them knew it. January was brutal, as Montana Januaries are, with temperatures that dropped to frightening depths and storms that locked the ranch in for days at a time. During a blizzard that lasted 4 days in the second week of the month, Jedediah and Susan were essentially confined to the house together, and what emerged from those 4 days was the kind of knowledge of another person that ordinary time would have taken months to build. They talked. They talked about everything, in the long lamplight hours when the wind screamed outside and the house was warm and close. She told him about her mother, who had died when Susan was 14, and who had been a practical, loving woman of strong opinions. She told him about her father, the complicated grief of loving a man who had made choices she could not approve of while also being the person who had read to her and taught her to love learning and called her his best student. She told him about the 4 years of teaching in Cheyenne, the children's names she remembered, the particular satisfaction of watching a child understand something for the first time. He told her things he had never told anyone. Not just the shape of the years he was not proud of, but the interior of those years, the reasoning he had used to justify things that did not deserve justification, the specific moment in each year when he had known he was moving further from who he intended to be, and the way he had continued anyway, and what that felt like to carry. She listened to all of it, not with the listening of someone collecting information or storing material for judgment later. With the listening of someone who was genuinely, completely attending to another human being. On the 3rd night of the blizzard, she said, "You have been punishing yourself." "I have been paying a debt," he said. "There is a difference between those things," she said. "You paid the debt when you turned your horse around and rode north. Everything after that is building a life. That is not punishment, that is living." He looked at her for a long time. "I am not sure I have known the difference." "I know," she said. "I have been watching you try to sort it out. And I think you are very close to having sorted it out," she said. "And I would like to see what you are like when you have." He reached out and tucked a strand of dark hair back from her face, a gesture so gentle that it surprised him that his hands, which had done rough work for most of his life, knew how to do it. She went very still at his touch, not from alarm but from the same quality of attention she gave everything full presence, nothing held back. He kissed her. It was unhurried and careful, and when it ended they were both quiet for a moment, and the blizzard howled outside and the fire burned steady and the lamp was warm on the table between them. "I should have done that at Christmas," he said. "Probably," Susan agreed, and she was smiling. He laughed. It was a real laugh, startled out of him, and she laughed too. And they were both laughing together in the warm kitchen while the blizzard drove itself into the walls outside, and it was the best night he had had in years. Putnam came back in February. He came with 2 men this time, which indicated that he had concluded that Jedediah Garrett was the kind of obstacle that required more than one man to move. He rode up to the property on a Tuesday afternoon when the snow was still thick on the ground but the weather had cleared, and Jedediah saw them coming from the distance and recognized Putnam's silhouette from 300 yards. He had been expecting this. "Go inside," he told Susan, who was in the kitchen yard feeding the chickens they had recently acquired, "and bolt the door." "I do not intend to hide," she said. "I know you don't," he said. "I am asking you to go inside because what I am about to do does not require a witness and I would prefer you not to see it." She looked at him for a moment, reading his face. "You are not going to do anything you cannot live with," she said. It was not a question. "No," he said, "I am not, but I may do some things that are not entirely pleasant to watch." She went inside. Jedediah walked out to the gate as Putnam and his 2 men arrived. The 2 men with Putnam were hired muscle, competent-looking but not extraordinary. Jedediah had encountered this type regularly in his previous life and knew how to read them. They were working men, not fanatics. They were doing a job for pay. "Garrett," Putnam said. "Putnam," Jedediah said. "I told you last time that if you came back you would deal with me directly." "I have come to deal with you directly," Putnam said. "I want the letter. I am willing to pay for it. Generously, I am willing to pay you as well for your trouble." "There is no letter," Jedediah said. "Susan Blackwell burned it in March of last year. You have been chasing a thing that does not exist." Putnam smiled thinly. "I find that difficult to believe." "That is your prerogative," Jedediah said. "But I want to explain something to you clearly so that there is no room for misunderstanding." He looked at Putnam with the full weight of what he was, not the rancher he had been trying to be for 3 years, but the thing underneath that, the thing he was bringing up now deliberately and consciously because this was the correct application of it. "I know men like you. I have known them all my life. I know how they think and what they value and what makes them stop pursuing a thing. I am going to tell you to leave this property and not return, and you are going to believe me when I tell you that returning will cost more than you are willing to pay." The 2 hired men had been watching Jedediah with the professional attention of men, assessing a potential complication. One of them had already adjusted his posture almost imperceptibly, the kind of small shift that meant a man had decided he was not getting paid enough for this particular situation. Putnam said nothing for a moment. He was also assessing. "She is just a woman," Putnam said. "She is under my protection," Jedediah said. "Those are not competing statements." Another silence. The wind moved across the snow. One of the hired men's horses shifted restlessly. "Even if she burned it," Putnam said, "she could testify." "She could," Jedediah said. "If she chose to, if you give her reason enough to choose to. But if you leave this place now and do not return, she has no particular reason to go looking for a prosecutor to tell her story to. That calculus changes, however, if you continue to come here." Putnam understood this. Jedediah could see him understanding it. It was the truth, and it was also the most useful lever available, and he was not above using it. "I want your word," Putnam said. "You will not get it," Jedediah said. "You will get my silence so long as you leave her alone." "That is the offer. It does not improve." Putnam looked at him for one more long moment, and then he turned his horse. He rode away. His 2 hired men rode with him, and Jedediah watched them until they had cleared his property and were well down the main road, and then he turned and went back to the house. Susan was in the kitchen, not hiding but standing at the window, which had a limited view of where he had been standing. When he came through the door, she turned around and he could see she had been holding herself together again with the controlled stillness she knew how to wear. "Is he gone?" she said. "He is gone," Jedediah said. "He will not come back." "How do you know?" "Because he is a careful man," Jedediah said. "Careful men calculate odds. The odds have changed for him." He paused. "Might have someone watch the property for a while to be sure, but he will not come back himself." Susan let out a long, slow breath. Then she crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him, and he held her, his hand on the back of her head, her face against his shoulder, and they stood that way for a while in the quiet kitchen with the February wind outside and the warmth of the stove filling the room. "I have been frightened of that man since March," she said, her voice muffled slightly against his shoulder. "I have been managing being frightened of that man for almost a year." "I know," he said. "You managed it remarkably." "I was terrified," she said. "Courage is not the absence of terror," he said. "It is walking into the gate anyway." She tilted her head back to look at him. "Did you make that up just now?" "I may have been sitting on it for a few months," he admitted. She laughed, that real unguarded laugh, and he felt it in his chest like light coming through a window. Spring came to Montana slowly and then all at once, the way it does, and Susan's kitchen garden began to show the preliminary signs of the ambition she had planned in the fall. She had laid it out carefully during the winter months, consulting a seed catalog she had ordered from a merchant in Billings, and by April the rows were green and determined. Jedediah found himself making small detours to pass by the garden in the mornings, which he acknowledged to himself was not strictly necessary, but which he found oddly satisfying, to see the thing she had planned through a winter coming into being in the spring. They had settled into something together that was entirely new for both of them. He had never been good with words, specifically with the kind of words people expected in the context of feeling things about other people, and Susan had known enough disappointment to move carefully around hope. But they had built something that did not require elaborate announcement. It lived in the way they moved around each other in the house, easy and knowing. It lived in the evenings when she read and he worked his accounts, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with anything other than what it already was. It lived in the Sunday mornings when they rode out together across the property, side by side on horseback, looking at the land, talking about cattle and weather, and the catalog she wanted to order more seeds from and the book she had just finished, talking about anything and nothing. It was, Jedediah thought, the closest thing to contentment he had ever experienced, and it frightened him slightly, not because he doubted it but because he had spent so many years operating in a world where things that felt this solid had a tendency to be taken away. He told her this one April evening. "I know how to manage when things are difficult," he said. "I have less experience with things being this." "This?" she prompted. He looked at her. They were on the front porch in the early evening, the sky going brilliant colors over the mountains, the smell of her garden on the air. "Good," he said. "Settled, real." She was quiet for a moment. "I know what you mean," she said. "I keep waiting for something to pull it sideways." "Does it feel like it will?" She considered him. "No," she said slowly. "It does not. And that is the most frightening thing, actually. When something is good and you start to believe it might stay good, the risk of it feels much larger." "Yes," he said. "That is it exactly." She reached over and took his hand, the way she had taken to doing, easily and without ceremony, as though it were simply the natural continuation of proximity. "I think," she said carefully, "that some things are worth the risk of hoping for them." He looked at her hand in his. He looked at the sky. He looked at the land he had built, the house, the fence, the beginning of something he had been trying to make for 3 years with the feeling that he might be building it for himself alone and that that might be sufficient, and the knowledge arriving quietly and fully now that it was not alone, that there was someone in it with him who had walked 4 miles on a September morning and changed the entire shape of what he was making. "Susan," he said. "Yes. I would like to ask you something, and I want to be precise about it because I think you deserve precision." She was looking at him now with that full attention of hers, her brown eyes steady. "I was done with that life," he said. "I had decided, firmly and completely, that I was done with riding and guns and the world that produces men like Putnam and the men I used to work alongside. I was going to be a rancher, a quiet man with a fence line and some cattle and 2 dogs and no entanglements." "And then I appeared at your gate," she said. "And then you appeared at my gate," he agreed. "And I need you to know that I have not had a single second thought about that. Not one. I want you to know that with certainty." He turned to face her fully. "I am asking you to marry me. Not because it is practical, not because it resolves any ambiguity in the town's opinion of our situation, but because I love you and I have been loving you since well before I had the sense to say so, and I would like to spend whatever is left of my life being the man you seem to think I already am." Susan was quiet for one long moment. Then she said, "You are already that man. You have been for quite some time." "That is not a yes," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is a yes. I love you, Jedediah. It has been a yes since the blizzard." He kissed her on the front porch with the mountains turning gold and red in the evening light, and Silas the dog, who had been sleeping in the yard, raised his head to look at them with the mild curiosity of a dog that has been disturbed from sleep and found nothing interesting enough to stand up for, and put his head back down. They were married on the 15th of May, 1884. The ceremony was held in Clearwater, at the small white church that served the town's Protestant congregation, performed by Reverend Hadley, who was a lean, formal man of 60 with a dry sense of humor and a genuine kindness behind it. Ruth Ridley came, looking triumphant in a manner she made no attempt to disguise. Frank Delaney was Jedediah's witness, in his best and only good coat, his silver-streaked hair combed flat. Tom Ridley stood in the back and grinned throughout the entire proceeding. Clara Hutchins was present, wearing her good Sunday dress, and when Jedediah shook her hand after the ceremony he said, "You sent her to me." Clara Hutchins looked at him over her spectacles. "I sent her to get a job," she said. "The rest was entirely your own doing." Susan wore a dress she had made herself over the course of March and April, ivory cotton with blue embroidery at the cuffs, the kind of work that took real patience and skill. She carried a small bundle of early wildflowers that she had picked that morning from the hillside above the north pasture. She stood in that church and looked at him with the clear, full attention that was her particular gift, and said her vows in a steady voice. He said his steadily, too, and meant every syllable of them. They rode home together in the late afternoon, side by side, back to the property, and when they came through the gate, his gate, their gate, he looked at it and thought about the last day of September, the last fence post, the words he had said to no one but the wind, and the universe's apparently irrepressible sense of timing. He was grateful for it. He was deeply, comprehensively grateful for it. Summer of 1884 was the best summer of Jedediah Garrett's life, and he thought that was an extraordinary thing to be able to say at 35. The ranch prospered. The herd had grown over the winter with the addition of 12 new cattle he had purchased from a neighbor to the north, and his 2 horses he had bred in the spring had produced 1 foal that showed considerable promise. Frank Delaney had agreed to stay on through the following year, which Jedediah was quietly relieved about because Frank was the best ranch hand he had ever worked with, and he had come to regard the man as something close to a trusted friend. Tom Ridley had met a young woman from the Clearwater school who was helping run the school, while the regular teacher was recovering from an illness, a cheerful young woman named Eliza, and he spent a great deal of time either talking about Eliza or looking toward town in a way that suggested he was thinking about Eliza. And Jedediah and Susan both regarded this development with the benign amusement of people who recognize themselves in someone else's beginning. Susan had taken over the ranch accounts entirely, and the books were in better order than they had been in the 3 years Jedediah had been keeping them himself. She had a methodical mind and a grasp of numbers that she applied with quiet satisfaction, and she had also identified, within the first month of going over the accounts systematically, 2 arrangements he had with local suppliers that were not as favorable as they could be, and had renegotiated them by letter. He read those letters before she sent them and was impressed in a way that made her laugh. "You seemed surprised," she said. "I am not surprised," he said. "I am appreciating." "Appreciating and surprised are using the same face on you," she said, and he did not argue the point. In the evenings they sat together on the porch or by the fire, and they talked the way people talk when they are genuinely interested in each other's minds, about everything that occurred to them, about the land and the town and the people in it, about books and ideas and the distant world that reached them through newspapers and letters, about the past and the future, about all of it. He told her one evening in July that he had been thinking about what she had said about the distance between who you were and who you were trying to be. "I think I have gotten there," he said, "or near enough that I can see it from where I'm standing." She looked at him with her full attention. "Tell me what it feels like," she said. He thought about it seriously because she deserved a serious answer. "It feels like the weight is still there," he said. "The past does not get lighter, but it has stopped being a debt I am paying and started being part of the ground I am standing on. The ground I built this from. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," she said. "You helped with that," he said. "You did the work," she said. "Both things can be true," he said. She smiled. "Both things are true." He reached over and put his hand on her face, and she leaned into it slightly, the easy way she had of receiving affection without performance, just present. "I love you," he said. "I love you, Jedediah," she said. "I have loved you since before the blizzard, if I am being entirely honest. Probably since the morning I came into the kitchen and you were making coffee and you looked at my nervous hands and did not say a single thing about them and just put a cup of coffee in front of me. That was the morning." He thought about that morning. He had not known, on that morning in late October, that she had noticed the deliberateness with which he had not remarked on her shaking hands. He had thought he was being unobtrusive. "You were paying attention to everything," he said. "I was frightened and exhausted and far from anywhere I knew," she said. "You were kind in a way that asked nothing in return. Of course I was paying attention." He thought about this for a while, about the accumulation of small choices that had brought them to this porch, this evening, this marriage, this life. The last fence post and the last of a promise and the creak of the gate. October arrived, and with it the first anniversary of Susan's arrival at Jedediah's gate. He had been planning something for this occasion for 2 months, with more care than he had applied to any logistical problem since building the house, and he executed his plan on the evening of September 30th with Frank Delaney's assistance, which Frank had provided with a completely straight face that nonetheless communicated absolute enjoyment of the situation. He set a table on the front porch as the sun went down, with the good cloth Susan had brought from her canvas bag, and the candle holders she had found at a general store in town, and a bottle of wine he had ordered from a merchant in Billings 3 weeks before. He made, with considerable effort and a level of concentration he did not normally apply to cooking, the same supper Susan had made on Christmas Eve: roasted chicken, sweet potatoes, cornbread, because those were the things she had made when she was trying to make the house feel like something worth having. When Susan came out of the house and saw what was on the porch, she stopped. She looked at it and then she looked at him, and he could see she understood exactly what this was. "You remembered the date," she said. "October 1st tomorrow," he said. "1 year since you walked through that gate." She came to the table slowly. She touched the cloth, the candle holders. She looked at the food. "You made all of this," she said, "with input from Ruth Ridley, who apparently knew exactly what you made on Christmas Eve because Tom told her, and Tom remembers everything you cook." She laughed, the full laugh. "How long did the chicken take you?" "Longer than I am willing to admit," he said. "Sit down before it gets cold." They sat across from each other on the porch, the mountains going dark blue in the dusk, the first stars appearing, the candles steady in the still air. They ate together and talked and laughed and were quiet in turns. And when supper was finished they stayed at the table until the night was fully dark and the stars were thick overhead. "A year ago I was walking 4 miles with a canvas bag and 62 cents, Susan said, looking at the stars. "I had no clear plan beyond reaching your gate and hoping." "What were you hoping for?" "Honest work," she said. "Safety. Enough time and distance from Cheyenne to figure out what came next." She looked at him. "I was not hoping for you, not specifically. I had given up on that kind of hoping. And now," she smiled at him across the candlelight, "now I am having considerable trouble remembering why I ever gave it up." He reached across the table and took her hand. "I want to tell you something," he said. "When you came through that gate I had just put in the last fence post on the south line. I had just told myself out loud to no one in particular that I was done. Done with all of it, the old life, the complications, all of it. I was going to be a simple rancher with a fence line and 2 dogs. You told me that, she said, in a manner of speaking. What I did not tell you, he said, was that I had not even finished saying it. I had not even finished making the promise when I heard the gate creak, and I turned around and there you were. She was quiet, looking at him. I have thought about that timing for a year, he said. I have decided that the universe has a sense of humor about human plans. And stubbornness, she said. And stubbornness, he agreed. Are you grateful for the timing, she said. He looked at her in the candlelight, the dark hair, the steady brown eyes, the face that had gone from worried and guarded to open and sure in the 12 months he had known her. The woman who had burned a letter on principle and walked 4 miles on courage and sat across from him in his kitchen and told him to his face that he was not the man he used to be before he had the sense to believe it himself. I am grateful for every single moment of it, he said. From the first creak of that gate to right now. She stood up and came around the table to him, and he stood to meet her, and she put her arms around him, and he held her against him with the mountains and the stars behind them and the house warm and lit behind them, and everything they had built together around them. I love you, Jedediah Garrett, she said. I love you, Susan Garrett, he said, and he felt the name sit right, the way things sit right when they are exactly what they ought to be. They went inside together, and the candles burned down slowly on the porch table, and Silas and Wren slept peacefully by the porch steps, and the Montana night was very clear and very still. Winter came again, harder than the last, and they moved through it together with the ease of people who had learned each other's rhythms and preferences, and knew how to share a small space in comfort. They read together. They argued about books with the pleasant energy of 2 people who both had strong opinions about what made a story worth telling. She tried to teach him French, and he was a spectacularly poor student, and they both found this very funny. He taught her to play cards properly. He had learned in his hired gun years to play with considerable skill, and she turned out to be naturally gifted at it and consistently beat him at poker by December, which Frank Delaney observed with quiet delight. In January of 1885, Susan told him she was going to have a child. She told him on a Tuesday morning after breakfast, sitting across the kitchen table with her coffee, with the same directness she brought to everything. He sat with it for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took both her hands in both of his. "Are you well?" he said. "I am very well," she said. "Are you all right?" He looked at her hands and at the kitchen around them and at the woman across the table, and he felt something he did not have adequate words for, something that was part joy and part terror and part a profound, quiet gratitude that sat in him like the steadiest flame he had ever felt. "I am better than all right," he said. "I am." He stopped. "You are using the face again," she said. "What face?" "The one that means you are feeling a great many things simultaneously and do not have a system for organizing them yet." He laughed. "Yes," he said, "that face. I am working on organizing them." "Take your time," she said, smiling. "We have until August." He came around the table and crouched beside her chair and held both her hands and looked at her. "I want you to know," he said, "that this is not something I was expecting, and it is the best thing I did not know I was waiting for." She looked at him with bright eyes. "I know," she said. "I feel the same way." He told Frank Delaney that afternoon, and Frank shook his hand with a grip that conveyed more feeling than any speech would have, and said simply, "Congratulations," and looked away at the mountains for a moment. And Jedediah understood that Frank was thinking about Mary, and he put a hand on the older man's shoulder briefly and said nothing, and Frank nodded. He told Tom Ridley, who immediately had to go find Eliza and tell her, because Tom Ridley could not contain good news for more than approximately 4 minutes. Ruth Ridley arrived the following afternoon as if she had been waiting for an invitation, which she probably had, and proceeded to take stock of the household preparations with the organized efficiency of someone who had been through this before and knew what was needed. She gave Susan a list of things to acquire and a list of things to do and a list of things not to do. And Susan received all of this with the good humor of a woman who was both grateful and quietly reserving judgment on a few of the items. Summer of 1885 arrived with the slow generosity of a Montana summer, warm days and cool nights, and the land at its fullest. Susan's kitchen garden was magnificent, a full season of careful tending having produced an abundance that she divided between their household and a modest exchange with neighbors, because Susan Blackwell, Susan Garrett, could not be in possession of extra food, while people nearby might be without and find that acceptable. She was large and warm and absolutely determined to continue doing everything she usually did until her body made that impossible, which tried Jedediah's patience in the particular way that loving someone and worrying about their stubbornness tries patience. He said as much. "You need to rest more," he said. "You need to stop hovering," she replied, without looking up from the account she was reviewing. "I am not hovering. I am standing in the doorway of my own kitchen." "Hovering can be done from doorways," she said. He retreated to the porch and sat with Silas and accepted that he had married a very stubborn woman and that he loved her unreservedly for it. The baby arrived on the 4th of August, 1885. It was a boy. He had dark hair and a strong opinion about the world that he expressed continuously and at volume, and he was, Jedediah thought, the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen, which he understood was what every parent thought and also believed completely. Susan held the baby against her chest in the lamplight of their bedroom, exhausted and radiant in the way of someone who has done an enormous and difficult thing and knows it, and looked at Jedediah sitting on the edge of the bed beside her with an expression that he would spend the rest of his life being grateful he had been there to see. "Hello," she said quietly to the baby. "We have been waiting for you. What do we name him?" Jedediah said. Susan looked at the baby seriously. "He looks like someone with strong opinions," she said. "He does," Jedediah agreed. "He takes after his mother." She looked up at him with a tired smile. "What about James?" she said. "For your father." Jedediah's father had been a man named James Garrett, hard and decent and gone for 20 years. He had not spoken of him often, but he had thought of him more in the months of this year than in the years before it. "James," he said. "James Garrett." He said it and it fit, the way his wife's name had fit in his, the way the house had fit when she was in it, the way all of it fit, the life he had made, the life he had not expected, the life that had arrived at his gate on a September morning before he had even finished deciding he would be doing without it. Ruth Ridley was in the house the following morning, as expected, with cornbread and strong opinions. Frank Delaney came by in the afternoon with his hat in both hands and looked at the baby for a long time with the expression of a man seeing something that reached into deep places, and said, "He is a fine boy," in a voice that was quieter than usual. Tom Ridley came with Eliza. Tom and Eliza had been married in April, which had proceeded with all the momentum of an inevitable thing, and Eliza held James and cooed at him, and Tom looked at Eliza holding the baby with an expression that told Jedediah that the next couple of years were going to see another addition to the Clearwater community. The following year arrived, and then the next, and the life they had built deepened and expanded in the way that good things do. James grew into a child of considerable personality, curious, loud, charming, and possessed of a stubbornness that was entirely his mother's, applied to goals that were entirely his own. By the time he was walking, he had already identified the horses as the most interesting things on the property, and pursued this interest with the focused determination of someone who has found their calling. Jedediah found this deeply familiar. Tom and Eliza had a daughter in the spring of 1887, which they named Clara after Mrs. Hutchins, who was deeply moved by this and expressed it by bringing them a covered dish every week for 2 months. Frank Delaney continued with the ranch and showed no signs of wanting to go anywhere, and somewhere in 1886 he had quietly begun corresponding with a widow in Billings named Helen, a fact which he did not mention directly, but which was evident to anyone who observed that he now went to town to collect the mail on a regular schedule, and returned from these trips in better spirits than he had left. Jedediah said nothing about this until Frank mentioned it himself, which he did in the autumn of 1887 with the delivery of someone reporting a fact, and Jedediah shook his hand and said he was glad, and Frank said thank you with more feeling than the word alone could carry. Helen Marsh came to visit in November of 1887 and was a woman of 45 with steady eyes and a direct manner that Susan immediately and thoroughly approved of. The two women sat at the kitchen table and talked for 2 hours while Jedediah and Frank worked outside, and when Frank asked later what they had talked about, Susan said, "Everything important," and Frank appeared to find this adequately reassuring. Frank and Helen were married in the spring of 1888. Jedediah had the extraordinary experience of being Frank Delaney's witness at a wedding, standing beside the man whose quiet faith in him over the years had been one of the things that held the ranch and the new life together, and feeling the full weight of what those years had made. The town of Clearwater continued to grow in the latter years of the 1880s, as the railroad pushed further north and new families came into the territory. There were debates about land use, about water rights, about the treatment of the Crow people whose ancestral territory this was, debates that could turn sharp and ugly as settlement pressures increased. Jedediah observed these debates and participated in them when it mattered, and Susan's school, she had returned to teaching, one afternoon a week at the Clearwater schoolhouse, which was as close to full-time as she could manage with James, and the ranch household gave her both a platform and an investment in the community's future that made her opinions known and listened to. She was not always comfortable to agree with. She had thoughts about the treatment of the Crow families in the region that put her in opposition to some of the more aggressive voices in Clearwater's growing population, and she was not shy about expressing them. Jedediah backed her always, not because he did everything she said, but because he had read enough of her reasoning to know that she saw clearly and argued fairly. There were nights when they lay awake talking about the things they could see coming for the territory, the increasing pressure, the questions of who had rights to what and how those rights had been established, and what the cost of ignoring that history was, and these were conversations that did not have easy conclusions, but they were conversations they had because they were that kind of people. In 1888, Susan was with child again. "I think it might be a girl this time," she told him one October evening. "What makes you say that?" "The way I feel is different," she said. "I cannot be more specific than that." "Different how?" "Quieter," she said. She was right. In the third week of March 1889 they had a daughter. She was quiet in the way Susan had predicted, alert and watchful and precise in her focus, which she shared with her mother. They named her Anna for Susan's mother. James, who was 3.5 years old and deeply invested in the question of whether he was going to have a brother or a sister, received the news that it was a sister with a moment of consideration, and then a declaration that a sister was acceptable. Susan, lying in bed with Anna in her arms and James sitting very carefully beside her under strict instructions about gentleness, looked at Jedediah standing at the foot of the bed with what felt like the entirety of his life arranged before him in one room, and she said, "Are you still organizing your feelings?" He laughed, full and real. "Working on it," he said. "I'll let you know when I get there." "Take your time," she said, exactly as she had said to him before James arrived. "We are not going anywhere." They were not going anywhere. The ranch stood on 60 acres of Montana land, the house warm against whatever weather the mountains sent, the fence line complete and maintained, the horses in the barn, the cattle in the pastures, the kitchen garden ready to go into the ground again come May. Susan's accounts were in order. Frank Delaney was in the south barn with Helen. Silas was asleep by the fire. Wren had passed in the winter of 1887, and they had mourned her properly, and Silas had been more subdued for several months after, and Jedediah had gotten him a companion eventually, A young brown dog James had named Patch with the absolute authority of a 3-year-old who considers the matter settled. The gate that Susan had come through on the first day of October, 1883, stood at the end of the road leading to the house, solid and unchanged. Jedediah thought about it sometimes. He thought about standing at that fence line with the hammer in his hand and the last post driven into the ground, and the certainty he had felt, real certainty, the kind that lives in your bones, that he was done, that the life of complication and consequence and other people's trouble was behind him. He had been certain. He had been completely certain. He had been finishing the sentence in his mind, the full formal commitment to peace, to simplicity, to the quiet ranch life he had built, and the gate had creaked. And a woman with loose dark hair and dust on her boots and 62 cents and a canvas bag and more courage than most men he had ever known had been standing there, looking at him with tired eyes that were also, he realized now looking back, the eyes of someone who had come a long way and was not going to pretend she had not. He would have told his certain self on that morning that you could plan for a life and build toward it with everything you had and still be surprised by what the universe saw fit to place at your gate at the exact moment. You had decided the gate was firmly and finally closed. He would have told that earlier self that being surprised in this particular way was the best thing that had ever happened to him. He walked through the house on that March evening in 1889, the baby sound asleep and Susan resting with James curled against her side, reading his picture book with tremendous seriousness, the fire going in the main room, the smell of supper still in the kitchen, Silas and Patch both occupying the best spots near the stove. He stood in the kitchen and looked at the table where he had first poured coffee for a woman who was holding herself together through will alone, and where he had eaten 10,000 meals, since with a family he had not known he was going to have, and he felt the weight of the past, and the fullness of the present, and the open possibility of the future all at once. He heard Susan say something quietly to James from the bedroom, and James's voice reply in the earnest tones of a small person explaining something important, and Susan's answering laugh. He stepped out onto the front porch. The evening was cold and clear, the stars beginning to come out over the mountains. The land was quiet. The gate at the end of the road was a dark shape in the dusk. He thought, I was done with that life. He thought, I was standing right here or near enough, with a hammer in my hand and a fence post behind me and a certainty I held like something solid and final. He thought, and then the gate creaked. He stood on his porch in Montana in the spring of 1889, and he smiled slowly in the dark. He was so grateful for that creak. He was grateful for a woman's courage and the particular mathematics of timing that placed her at his gate at the exact moment it could change everything, and for the accumulated decisions, hers and his, that had led from that moment to this one. He was grateful for Frank Delaney and his silences and his faith. He was grateful for Ruth Ridley's complete lack of subtlety. He was grateful for the blizzard that had given them 4 days of close warmth and honest talking. He was grateful for Christmas Eve and a half-finished promise and the specific creak of a gate hinge in September. He was grateful that the universe, when it had something important to arrange, had arranged it with a woman named Susan Blackwell and a gate that opened. He heard her voice from inside the house, calling his name. Jedediah. He turned and went inside. She was sitting up in the bed with Anna in her arms again, James having been guided towards sleep, and she looked at him when he came through the bedroom door with the full attention that had never diminished in 6 years, the same clear, steady regard she had given him across a kitchen table when she was a stranger, and he was a stranger, and neither of them knew yet what was going to come of it. I was starting to wonder where you went, she said. Front porch, he said, thinking. What about? He sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at her, his wife, the mother of his children, the keeper of his accounts and his house and the better part of his heart, the woman who had walked 4 miles and said her own name to a stranger and changed the shape of everything. About gates, he said, and timing. She looked at him with the slight curve of understanding at the corner of her mouth that he had come to know as the look she wore when she was thinking something that made her quietly happy. "Are you glad the gate creaked?" she said. "I am glad the gate creaked," he said, "every day." She leaned her head against his shoulder, careful of Anna, and he put his arm around her and she settled into the familiar warmth of it. And outside, the Montana stars were thick and steady over the mountains, and the land was quiet and the house was full, and everything was exactly as it should be. Everything was exactly as it should be.